Hello, everyone. I'm Eric D'Souza, and joining me today is Susan Calder as we are going to discuss yet another story from cold Canadian crime. Welcome, Susan. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing fine. It's really cold here in Calgary, minus 20 degrees and snowing.
Ooh, yeah, I know. Actually, let's get right to an early question since you brought up the weather. A lot of people who are going to watch this are obviously Central Canadian, Toronto, Montrealers. In your book, you have a character, or sorry, in your short story, you have a character who moves from Toronto to Calgary, and she thinks, "Wow, it's really cold." I'm from Montreal, as you are. Is it Calgary winter that much harder than a Toronto Montreal winter?
I think it is. The only difference is we do have our Chinooks, and so occasionally we'll get, a warming, in the midst of the cold. And it tends to be very bright and sunny quite often. So that's a compensation. But I do feel that it gets really cold sometimes. And the days are shorter too. We're a little bit farther north. So you maybe get a grace period of a couple of hours after lunch when it feels balmy, and then you're back almost to nighttime. So I think it is colder, but a lot of Calgarians might not agree with me. They'll say it's a dry cold.
I've heard that term before. I imagine in your time to Calgary, you've been to Edmonton. I hear it's much worse in Edmonton.
Yeah, it's just a little bit more, and they don't get the Chinooks. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
well, we kind of fast forwarded right past your bio. So let me back up a little bit and introduce everybody to you. So Susan is a Calgary author who grew up in Montreal. She has written four novels, three in a series and one standalone. She serves on the board of When Words Collide Readers and Writers Festival and is the vice chair of an upcoming, I'm going to say it the English way, Bouchercon, no, Bouchercon Mystery, I almost
Voucher, voucher.
Bouchercon
Yes.
convention in 2026. It looks like a French word to me. I apologize.
Well, I
Um,
understand.
Now, ideally, these interviews I have with cold Canadian crime authors take about 10 minutes, but I have a feeling with your background, it's going to be a little bit longer. So
Okay.
let's start with your short story. So for cold Canadian crime, your story is called The Deadly Flu. Uh, which I read from your website is your first venture into historical fiction. Why did you want to venture into this new subgenre?
Well, I right from the time I started writing, I had an idea that eventually I would write a historical fiction story. I like historical fiction, so it's been there all along. When the COVID-19 pandemic started, I got very much interested in the 1918 influenza pandemic, which was formerly called the Spanish flu, and I read a couple of books on it. Just because the parallels seem so similar to what was going on with us. So I became very interested in that. And then I just developed this idea of a murder mystery that could have happened during that time period, and it reflects a little bit on what's happening today, I think, too, for me anyway.
Yeah, I get the. I guess it was cute to have a sneak peek of what Calgary was 100 years ago. But reading your story, at the same time, it was amazing how a crime story is still sort of a crime story. The motives of the bad guys or the individuals are still, the same. It's almost like you can transport that story to today with a few minor details. Do you feel the same way? Is like crime relatively the same, or does it change with time?
I think so. People are people. Like nowadays, you might read a lot of stories about drug dealing, I find, in crime fiction. But in that day, at least a few years later, prohibition came in the States, and you'd have the rum runners, and probably there was a little bit of it starting to go on at this point. So those would be the same kind of people too. So I think, it's all probably the same motives: love, greed, whatever, that hiding secrets, whatever people want to go. So I think it is about people and things like that. A big difference is they didn't have the intricate forensics that you have today, which in some cases makes it easier because if you're not familiar with those forensics, you don't have to worry about them. So that's one thing.
Uh, yeah, another thing that I guess that came across too from cold Canadian crime is just trying to imagine how cold, like we were talking about Calgary now in the cold, but there's mentions of like thin houses with just a fireplace to keep them warm. I can Imagine those must have been sturdy people.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. You crawl into bed and half frozen, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, that must have been tough. Well, let's touch on your books a little bit. I noticed that you wrote 3 Paula Savard series and then went to a standalone. A little bit of research told me, or you told me that you haven't ended the Paula story, that there's going to be a 4th book coming out next year. Another thing that jumped out is I noticed that she's an insurance investigator, insurance adjuster, which I
Mhm.
thought was an odd choice. And then I read also that you have a past in that.
And
um,
that's why I chose it. Yeah.
it seems almost like a natural, but I can't imagine too many insurance adjuster detectives. Are you unique on this one, or can you think of another one?
Well, I think you could almost compare Sue Grafton to something like that. I think her character uh, she does investigate. I guess she's a private investigator, but I think she starts out with a lot of insurance investigation. I could be mistaken. Uh, I don't know. I really just chose it because I had worked in the field, and so I was familiar with the work and that kind of person who would do it. And it didn't really occur to me that it would make a crime series. I wasn't even thinking of the first book as a series. I really thought it was going to be a standalone. So I didn't even. It was only really as I got along that I realized that an insurance investigator does do detecting work. That's what your job is. You're trying to find out what really happened. Are people trying to put the wool over you, and you often they are, and who's people are cheating on you. And of course you could get into things like art theft, which could be fraudulent, and there are many areas like that. So I realized that it could become there's a lot of scope for it in there, but it was purely accidental that it happened.
Um, well, you did write a standalone eventually, To
Yes.
Catch a Fox. Sort of, you're chugging along with your series, wrote 3, took a little break to do a standalone. So, what was your inspiration, or why did you feel like you wanted to write this standalone and take a break?
Okay, well, that's a great question. It's a different form, original form. That was the first. That To Catch a Fox was the first novel I completed, and it wasn't a murder mystery novel. This was probably 20 years ago,
No.
and but it did. I sent it out to publishers. It didn't sell, so I put it away, and I shifted to writing murder mysteries, which was another genre I'd been interested in writing, and got into that with a few of the series books. But this To Catch a Fox story still lingered with me. And I really thought it was dead in the water. But then out of the blue, an idea came for me for a totally new story. It was still had the same title, roughly the same main character, although I changed some details about her. The supporting characters were all different, and what exactly was happening to her was the same. But in all of the stories, she was going on a quest to find out what happened to her mother. But the details of the story changed, and I just felt the story was there, and I decided to just take a little break from the series and write it, because that was just a story that had sat with me for so many years. So that was really the reason for it. But in effect, it in a different form, it was the first. It preceded the series.
Actually, that's really interesting, because I think, well, I know, because I've spoken to many authors, that we almost all have that first novel, that first unpublished novel that's sitting on a hard drive somewhere, or a floppy disk, or on
Or
paper in our. So it's great that you're actually able to revisit it and publish it. So congratulations to you.
I know, as you say, or in the drawer, as we used to say in the old days. Print copies. And I really thought that was where it was going to be, but I did revisit it. But the old version is still somewhere in the drawer, and I don't want anybody to read it.
One of the things I also learned about you is that you've been very active in When Words Collide. I was happy to see that you guys were able to convert to the Zoom and have quite a successful festival. But I've heard stories of how good the live event was, and then I heard that, or I saw a post that you're actually doing a live one. And sort of good news, bad news, I heard it's going to be your last one. So you've been involved with this organization for a long time. Can you tell us a bit about When Words Collide?
Sure. I jumped in right the very first year. And which is, I don't know, well, I mean, it's 11 official years, but then there was 3 Zoom years. And my real reason for going was that I was Robert Sawyer, who's the science fiction writer, was one of the special guest authors there, and I'm a fan of his writing. So I went, and I wasn't expecting too much of it, but I was just blown away by the dynamic and the energy of it. The core people involved have tended to be science fiction and fantasy writers. And I think those guys know how to put on a convention, Comic-Con and all this stuff, and people in costumes, and just the energy of the convention was just terrific. And what I learned from the panels and the presentations, and it's all volunteer. And I've gone every year. And then eventually I joined the board. I was actually officially the liaison with the Writers Guild of Alberta on the board. And so I got a little bit more involved in the organization of it and some of the programming. And I just felt that it was, I learned a lot. There's something for everybody. You can learn the basics of writing up to promoting your book and how to sell 1 million copies if you could, and everything in between, and with interesting guests. So that it was we put on a great festival. I'm sorry to see it go, but people, during COVID, it lost a lot of steam, even though they managed the 3 years of the online festival. And it was really much, it was essentially about people getting together in person and interacting. And so it lost a lot there, and lost a lot of the dynamism of the leadership. And so it will be, unfortunately, next year will be its last hurrah, but I'll be attending. I'm registered, and I'll be there in full force. Looking forward to it.
Well, you're not retired from event planning, because you're doing one of the biggest crime thriller conventions for 2026. I'll try it again, Boucheron 2026.
Perfect. You got it.
For those of us who don't know what that is, could you explain that event?
Okay. Well, the name comes from a critic who would review mystery novels, Anthony Boucher. That was his name, and I suppose that's an American pronunciation. And I don't know if he started the festival or it was started in his honor, probably. And it's the largest mystery writing and reading convention in North America. It takes place every year. It's considered a fan convention, so most people come because they want to see the authors, and they draw a very big name authors sometimes, and people that you would Lee Child, Michael Connolly, a lot of these people are there, and so it takes place every year at the end of summer or in the fall, and in different cities. And it usually is an American city, but this will be the 5th time that it's in Canada. Calgary made a bid for it to host it in 2026. It's like the Olympics. You have to bid. You actually have to present a bid, and that you can actually pull it off with the hotel and the facilities. And it is like that. Although nobody was bidding against us, but you still have to bid, and you have to prove to them that you can do it because they want to meet a certain standard. And this was a Tourism Calgary initiative. Their representative, who lives in Washington, D.C., happened to just run into the Boucheron organizer, and her job is to try to get conventions to Calgary. And she thought it would be a good convention to get to Calgary, and so then they were trying to find the Calgary mystery community, and they did a Google search, and somehow they came up with me, probably because I have been involved in When Words Collide and other Crime Writers of Canada and other things. And I was doing some presentations at that time because I had a new book. And anyway, they contacted me, and I was quite excited about it. And the last one, by the way, in Canada was 2017 in Toronto. I don't know if you were there, but I was actually there too. So that helped, that I had some familiarity with it. And so we just started meeting online with them, and then the Bouchercon representative, and they worked on the bid and presented it. And then they asked if I would be a chair. And I thought, that's a big thing to take on. I mean, this is really out of my zone. And it's 4 years too, a 4-year commitment. And I didn't want to let people down. And I thought, and I noticed that they typically, more than half the time, there's co-chairs. And so I said I would be a co-chair. I agreed, because I just felt it was too exciting to say no to, even though it felt overwhelming. It's just so interesting. And so I thought I have a friend, Pamela McDowell, who is also a writer, super organized. She's been a volunteer coordinator at Heritage Park, which is our local kind of Upper Canada village. And she's really great at that kind of thing. So I got her in. So she and I are the co-chairs. And it's been really great to have somebody to work with, to bounce ideas off and to understand what we're going through. And so that's how I getting involved. And Tourism Calgary sent out a survey. They drummed up a lot of people who expressed volunteer interest. So we've started with the got a pretty good volunteer committee, started there, plus a whole list of names of other people who want to be involved. And I hope Crime Writers of Canada will be involved. I think they usually are, especially with it being in Canada.
Mhm.
And Sisters in Crime is always plays a role in some ways, so they'll be there. So it's quite an exciting thing.
It is very exciting. You and I were chatting before we hit record, and I made a comment that sort of Calgary's a new hotbed, and you were mentioning it's not new at all, is it?
I don't think so. We've had a lot of, there's been a lot of writing. We have WordFest too, which takes place every year, and we're hoping for both of our events will be in October of that year. So we're hoping maybe to share some writers, or perhaps I could share some expenses of bringing people in and things like that. So we've had WordFest every year, and that's presented it. Our own Suzette Meyer won the Giller Award this year in the literary field, and we have a lot, and there's a pretty solid, strong crime writing community here too.
Yeah, I got to meet Julie Henner, your new
Crime
Writers of Canada representative, and I totally agree.
Julie's great.
Yeah, she had some live readings a couple of weeks ago, and it seems like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Well, it was great chatting with you today, Susan. I actually did a good job too, because my main character is Suzanne, so I have to I have to remember to call you Susan.
Oh, okay. And good thing I'm not Susan Boucher, right?
Then I'd be in a lot of trouble. Yeah, and actually, even referring back to your story really quickly, my grandmother's name is Nellie, and my mom's Madeline. So it's like, two characters from your book.
Yeah. Well, in historical fiction, you have to look up the names popular to that era, right? And yeah.
Right. Well, to learn more about your story and all the other ones, you can visit Crime Writers of Canada. Also for Christmas, just to tell everybody, if you're watching this sort of real time, the book is 40% off, both on ebook and paperback right now, just in time for Christmas. And also you can learn a little bit more about Susan at her website, susancalder.com, right?
That's correct, yeah.
.com.
Yes.
All right. It was a joy chatting with you today.
Well, thanks. This has been fun, and thank you very much, Eric.
And thank you for
Happy holidays. Happy holidays to you.
Thank you. To you too.
Yeah.